Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Condoland podcast, Addendum, which is our new series when we don't get through enough content somewhere else and they boot it down to the podcast. And that's what they've done. So here we are. I'm with Armand Conant, partner at Shibley, Righton, Patricia Elia, senior lawyer at Elia and Associates. And today what we're going to do is we're going to answer all of the questions that came in during our recent webinar on status certificates, and probably, if we have time, talk about some other things that we wanted to talk about and didn't get a chance. As I mentioned in the webinar, we had a few sessions prepping for the webinar session, and each one of those sessions went over time and had to be stopped because we just had a lot to talk about. And every time we'd get into a specific case, we would talk and talk and talk and talk. And so here we are, a chance to get more content out. And as mentioned in the webinar, there may probably be a course as well on this topic, one of our certificate courses that ACMO runs, so stay tuned for that. So without further ado, I'm going to run through some of the questions and let the experts talk and hopefully not butt in too many times. So the first question that came, and I'm just going in order on our Q&A from that webinar, was actually the first two questions are similar, and they are, what are we doing about real estate agents ordering status certificates, making their own to sell later for later sales and posting them on their website? So I didn't really know this was a problem, but apparently some agents are taking the certificate, scraping the name off and posting it, I guess, as like a little advantage for themselves and saying, hey, you don't need to buy one, or whatever the case. The downside of this, is management companies are getting cheated out of their fees, but there might be some liability there. And either of you guys want to jump in, please go ahead.
Well, I'll just start by saying, first of all, I think real estate agents need to have more training in what are condos and how to buy and sell condos, which leads to the status certificate. And so I think if we could get to the TREB, the RICO, and other organizations to help train them, that would be a big step. But on this specific question, I think that does open up a tremendous area of liability for, could be the real estate agent, because they're posting one that does not even apply to the unit that they're now dealing with. And I know Patricia and I have talked about this. It really gets interesting if I issue one today and then somebody cuts off the unit number and name and tries to post it and say this applies to the whole corporation. Patricia, I mean, you had some great comments on
Well,
what this does.
I wouldn't rely on it. And if I'm buying a piece of real estate, there's definitely no way that I'm going to take a copy and cut and paste version of a status certificate. So I'd strongly recommend warning agents about that, and even on the status certificate saying some wording to the effect that this status certificate cannot be relied on by anybody to whom it has not been issued, because I think that's the first thing. But the other thing is, too, this brings up an interesting thing where people are cutting and pasting status certificates. So how do you know that the content is accurate? Maybe they didn't like what you put in Section 12, so they modified the language. I would definitely advise everybody that's in a transacting business to get their own status certificate. And if there can be a warning on the status certificate form that these people are cutting and pasting, I would suggest it. Because I do think
even in the covering letter.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Armand, that the real estate agent is opening themselves up to professional liability issues. And, putting RICO or the organizations on notice that deal with real estate agents might be helpful, because they don't want to see their premiums go up either.
That's right.
Well, I said I wasn't going to butt in, but sorry. Yeah, I said I wasn't going to butt in, but I am. Like, from my perspective, if I saw my name, my signed name on a copy of something on a real estate's website, I'd be sending them a letter saying, take it down. And the reason is, I don't want to get myself involved in something where, let's say I had a status certificate I issued and 2 weeks later something came up, a special assessment or a report, and it was substantial, and this person's not showing that because they don't want to pay again. I don't want my name on that. And so
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Eric, it goes to the whole point too of who can rely on it. I mean, I know we talked before this podcast about that. And if Armand Conant takes one off the website and I'm buying in a building and I don't order my own status, or my lawyer doesn't, I'm not sure that the corporation is bound by it, regardless of whether there's a mistake in it or not. I would never want to rely on it. When I used to do real estate, I would never rely on one unless it was specific for my unit and ordered by me.
And I think you mentioned, Patricia, it might be a good idea to put at the bottom, along with all those other disclaimers, this is for the unit specified only. Just put it in English that this is something that belongs to this person and applies to that person only. not to
Yeah, and
anyone
whoever
else.
ordered it, right? Because it would
Yeah.
be the vendor's real estate agent or the vendor that would order it, do this for the MLS or the listing. But then if a purchaser wanted to rely on it, I would say that they have no right to rely on it,
Yeah.
you
And they
know?
would be buyer beware.
Okay.
Right,
So let's
exactly.
fair points. Let's move on. So the next question was, if you provide the status, say 2 days late, are we still in a deemed position, or does the late status override section 75.5? So I think in context here, this had to do with if you deliver a status certificate late.
Yeah, I was saying at the meeting, or in our webinar, there were the two sections. One dealt with if you produce it late, what happens? And the second one is if you fail to give one totally. So there's late and failing to give. I'll give a legal answer and then a real answer. I know people hate that. Legally, the Condo Act is the Condo Act. And 76.5 is the failure to give a certificate. Technically, if it's 2 days late, it's 2 days late. That's not giving a certificate. You fall into 76 sub 5, and therefore you're deemed to have given one that states there's no default on payment of common expenses. Board has not declared any increase in the common expenses since the budget, and no special assessment for the reserve fund. So that the legal answer is 2 days late. In the real world, I'm not giving this as advice, but I would suggest if you are 2 days late, get it out as fast as you can. And normally people don't hold you to the 2 days being 2 days late under the Condo Act. But again, that's not legal advice. But don't just say, well, I'm too late, so I'm just too late. I would get it out really fast.
Most of the
Yeah.
time, agents will come to you and say, "Where's my status certificate? It's been 9 days," and you'll get lots of reminders.
You do.
Yeah.
Yeah, it won't
Yeah.
just lapse. They'll tell you.
And
Even
they're
when in
also
the
the ones that,
shower, I
yeah,
think
they try
you
to get
get
you out of your
reminders.
shower.
Yeah. But I think it's I think it's important that we stick and abide by the framework under the act, and
Right.
you get no grace if you're late, unfortunately. But Armand is right. Cover yourself on the back end, issue it as quickly as possible, um, because at least then the party who has received it has knowledge
Correct.
and can mitigate their damages, right? Like that's the other side of it. If they're going to come at you after a deemed statement, well, then you've got to say, but then I corrected it and you knew. So what did you do to mitigate your loss, right? What did you, because you hadn't closed necessarily. Now, if they were closing and this was within days or hours of closing, you may have a problem. But Armand is right because at least that can actually act as a backstop for any damages.
And if you think about if I'm acting for somebody who's requested it and then Eric is 2 days late, it's very rare for the party, whether it's a purchaser, a refinance, a bank, to come in and say, oh, okay, you are 2 days late, therefore you're deemed to have no default in common expenses. When 2 days later they get something. But again, that's the practical answer.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
A mortgagee may hold you to it.
And a mortgagee could.
Yeah, don't be late is the answer.
Don't be late.
Short answer, don't be late. Okay, then the next question actually is repeated in several other questions, and essentially has to do with disclosure. So this one specifically had to do with you do a condition report or some kind of condition assessment. It says that something's going to need to be done in 5 years. You got a parking garage and the rebar is going to need in 5 years, you're gonna have to do some work, something like that. Lots of money. Do you actually send the condition report? And I guess this is a broader issue of how much, is there an over disclosure? Is there a point where you're over disclosing, you're sending too much to a potential buyer?
Well, I think there's a risk, right? I think if you know that something is coming up in the reserve fund study, you're not going to report everything that is a project that's coming up there, right? So if something arises that presents something out of the, let's say, the information or the content that forms part of the status certificate, and you have a report, I would not give the report out. All you need to do is really let people know if their common expenses may be augmented by this project coming on board, and you have to give them enough information so that they are provoked into asking you questions. So, two things: you don't kill the deal, and you don't give away evidence that could be used against the corporation. I think is very important to consider as you move through this, because it may come back to bite you as well. right? Because what if the condition assessment changes? What if it wasn't that firm answer and something else has gone wrong? You never know with the deterioration of capital assets. The rebar example is a perfect example. You chip away, you find something more concerning underneath that. And then they'll say, but you only disclosed this report.
Right.
But yet you had a scope for something else. And then you get into gray areas that are harder to anticipate, and disclose. Like, don't give everything away, but give enough away. Don't over disclose. Armand, what do you
Yeah,
think?
I agree, Patricia. And everyone should remember the purpose of the status certificate is to give a point in time for people to make a considered view or decision on whether or not they're going to refinance or buy a unit. And that's why when the discoverability principle I discussed in the webinar, that it's what the board knew or reasonably ought to have known. So if you know, and it goes to what Patricia said, something that's going to be unusual, that will be a significant increase in contribution to the reserve fund, or a possible special assessment, or a possible loan, well, you know that. And the fact that you're punting it down the road to your 3 more years, but it is, then it's going to be big, is not enough in your reserve fund as you go. I think if you know that today with the condition report, never give a copy of the report. I agree 100% with Patricia. And I just have a client last week where we have exactly that, and everybody's wanting the engineering reports, and we refuse to give it properly, in my view. Second of all, you've got knowledge. So you've got to be careful, as Patricia said, about balancing that, not losing a deal, but protecting your corporation. And your number one duty is protect the corporation and not the deal. But how do you do that? It's that wordsmithing becomes important. So I've often used language like the information available to the board at this time is that there could be, and then fill in the blanks. This could result in, fill in the blank, but you say of ongoing investigations are underway and no determination is made at this point. So there may not be anything, but then you've disclosed it.
Yeah. And I think in the
Okay.
FCC 11 case, it says that we're suggested that we have to put ourselves in the shoes of a reasonably prudent purchaser.
Right.
So we have to think about the recipient of that document and how much they would need to know to ask further questions.
And on that, Eric, I agree with FCC. So many boards and our clients are the balance of the scales are too much you can't affect market value of our units. So let's not hide it, but let's not fully disclose it. It's not because they don't know what's going to happen, and eventually there's going to be something happening, but they're worried about market value, and that's a delicate balance.
And that brings us, that's a great segue to the next question.
I had a plan.
manager advises that there will be a need for a special assessment or large fee increase at the end of the year, but the board wants to wait for a formal vote before adding it to the status certificate. Should this be stated on the certificate, or should the manager follow the board direction?
There's a good one. First of all, there's no formal vote ever required for that
Nope.
kind of matter. So they wouldn't need, it could be a board saying we want to do a straw poll or a consensus of the owners. When I was the administrator, court-appointed administrator for one, and we had a huge, like $5 million, I called all the owners in and said, we can borrow, we can special assess. And we were talking like $40,000 per unit. And that was not a formal vote, but it was 100% in the room. We do not believe in loans or interest, special assess us. If that's what they're talking about, that's a different thing. But again, they have knowledge that something's coming.
Well, I think what they're saying here is, there's a need for a special assessment. The managers brought it to the board's attention. The board hasn't said, yes, we're going to do that. It's known, but it hasn't been approved.
Oh, you mean a vote of the board?
Yeah, it's hard to tell what their meaning is here, but I read it that way, that, manager comes to the board, says, hey, there's going to be a special assessment. We've got this big problem. We don't have the funds. We need another $500,000. The board has received the email, said, we'll talk about it at the next board meeting. And then you get a request for a status certificate. Are you putting in that we're going to need $500,000, or are you waiting until the board talks about it and approves it?
You're putting in, you need close to approximately $500,000, because the methodology of payment is not really the risk that the purchaser needs to manage, right? The purchaser needs to know that this is coming so that they can either figure out that they're going to, for example, negotiate a lower purchase price with the vendor, or they're going to put aside the money because they think this is just the greatest building ever, but they need to know it's coming. Because I think in the Bruce case, one of the challenges was that the board knew they should have disclosed because they were quite aware, even though they didn't have final numbers. And then Mr. Bruce was able to step out of the special assessment, which means that everybody else in the condominium had to pay his portion. And I think that's what you've got to think about is who's the audience and what's the impact, because there's no need to have absolute certainty. You can draft a status certificate with parameters and say, we are looking to determine whether this will be a special assessment or a fee increase or a combination thereof or a borrowing. Those are methodologies, but it doesn't change the fundamental fact that money is needed.
You're short $500,000. So in that case, we're aware of a problem and we believe the cost, won't exceed 600,000, whatever the case is. More discussion is required, but this may be on the horizon.
And I think, Eric, some of that too will be not every letter or every email going to the board about a matter is something that has to be disclosed. But when you've got a professional manager doing a manager's report to the board, you guys are professionals. And if you say, look, we've got this coming down, maybe we don't know the final price. A board would have to do it at their own risk, their own peril. If they
there's not a lot of ways around that.
Right.
You're not finding a cheap contractor to get you out of something like that. It's
Nope.
necessary.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I guess what I'm getting at here, sorry to finish on this. If an owner was to write the board and said, I think you need a $500,000 project to fix our roof or something, that is not something that would be reasonable for a board to say we have to disclose it. See, that's where the nuance comes in.
Hey, the next question, this one's interesting. There's so in many buildings, there's sometimes amounts owed from operating to reserve. In this scenario, there is 100,000 due to reserve due to low operating funds. So they stop transferring the funds to reserve in order to keep the cash flow going and operating. Should that be disclosed on the status certificate? My guess here, before I even bring it to you guys, is that's in your financial statements.
If it's at the end, well, the monthlies, but if you're in the current year and you haven't done your audit yet, then it wouldn't be until the audit is done.
Correct. If you're in that period between the audit, yep.
Because I've got clients that unfortunately are saying, can we quote in air brackets, borrow from the reserve fund to pay for something? But what they really mean is we haven't contributed the whole year yet to the reserve fund, and as long as at the end of the fiscal year the reserve fund is up,
find the money magically and put it back, and it's pushing the problem down the road. So they're saying if that's the case here, do you disclose it? And I guess you're right. If it's after the audit, after the year-end audit, and something's happened, do you disclose that?
Yeah, and I think the other thing is too, sometimes when we think about these things, we expand our own scope of risk by doing something like this. And so what would be the time frame that you're measuring that at, right? Because a status certificate is just a day in a fiscal year, right? So tomorrow it could be fine. And what if you miss it? And this is the thing, if you keep adding issues like this to report on, which are really micro issues, and they really fail to sort of tag into the documents that are attached to the status certificate, I think the corporation and the management company could be exposing themselves to more risk than the certificate is really requiring them to do, right? Because, even in our condo, sometimes we as a board decide we have the money for the reserve fund. We're just holding it so that we can transfer it into GICs. It's not that it's not tagged for reserve fund. It's just not in there. Would we be offside? Maybe technically, but then what's the consequence? Are we actually underfunded? We're not. We have the money. But then you see how the calculation and the dialogue and the qualifications become actually more specific. So we have to write more, and that might scare people. You've got to also think about keeping it compact, and maybe even the audience you're writing to doesn't always appreciate what you're saying to them. So I think it's one of these things that, you should bring it to the board's attention, but really being offside on the funding, it's really an annual issue. It's not a monthly or daily issue as well.
But I guess with Eric, sorry, Patricia, I didn't mean to.
Go ahead.
If they know ahead of time they're going to be $100,000 short at the end of the year, if they know that now because of our operating, then that they have knowledge.
Yeah,
and that be short.
And we can disclose that on the status
And we
certificate,
would,
right?
exactly.
That we might have to bump our common expenses, or there may be an event that
Yeah, your next
requires
reserve
us.
fund study, you're going to be short and you're going to have to raise fees accordingly. So yeah, that's an
Yep.
interesting question. It's a good one.
Mhm.
The next one that came in, can an audit that is signed by the board but not yet approved? Oh, that's not even a correct question. I think what they mean here, I'll go out on a limb here, but I think the real question they're trying to ask here is a draft audit. Can a draft audit be included, or should it be a fully approved audit that goes into the
You're
status?
talking about the approved audited financial statements for the year?
Correct. Yeah.
As approved by the board, I think.
Yeah. The question had a mistake in it, and I almost read it, but I'm going to take the meaning to be, does it have to be an approved audit, or can it be a draft?
I think it should be approved.
I would say so.
Correct.
Yeah, because I think if it's going out in the package, that's important to have it signed off. And I think, what I've been seeing at some meeting agendas is that there's an item on the agenda for AGMs for the owners to approve the audited financials. The audit, just for clarity, there is no approval of the audited financials by owners. That's just not the way that works, even though the auditor
that's how the
works.
question was worded. So we don't do that. The
No.
audit is approved by the board,
Right.
and once
So I
approved,
wouldn't
it
put a
can go out.
draft in the package. I would get it
No.
signed and get it finished.
Yes, and I agree with that 100%. The only other point I would add is that if you've got an unapproved but a draft audit, and there is something in there that the auditors pointed out that should be in a status certificate,
Disclose that, right?
that, because now you have knowledge, even though it's not approved by the board yet, but you've got knowledge of it.
So clearly, the common theme here is once you have knowledge of something material, significant, that could impact condo fees, or that someone should know, disclose it.
Disclose it, and then we can work on wording, such as we've already done, of we don't know the amount yet, or we're still looking at funding alternatives. Like, we can do language like that, but disclose it.
Okay, so the next question I think we touched on and answered in the webinar, but I'll ask it anyways. What do you do, and I like this one, what do you do when a realtor refuses to order a status certificate and wants a million questions answered prior to putting in an offer? You do nothing.
Yeah,
You
click.
you do nothing.
Like,
Yeah, you make
hang
them
up
order
the
the
phone.
status certificate.
It's your 5 calls when you were in the shower you were telling us about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and every
No,
night,
the short answer is whether it's you've given a status certificate and there's additional questions, or one isn't, they don't want to get one, do not answer questions to anybody. You, the manager, are exposing yourself to liability.
yeah, they can afford the $89. That's fine.
Yeah, and I think it's just not worth the risk of being named in a lawsuit or something like that because of a conversation you had on the phone. Just always conclude with, I think it's best if you order a status certificate.
Yeah.
Right?
Again,
Be
you're
polite
not
and just-
doing any favors by
No,
doing favors here.
no, exactly.
No.
And you've got other things to do. So then answer questions by realtors who don't order a status certificate. Get the status certificate.
Or it's a vendor or a purchaser's lawyer who calls you up and wants more information. It's also deadly when that happens too. And we know
And I think
you want
you've
to
got to
help.
be careful there, though, right? When the purchaser's lawyer is calling, I think it's important to, have the manager feel comfortable to answer the question or direct to legal,
That's
depending
what I
on-
was going to say. Yeah.
right? And
Like a
depending on what
typical
the
one
question.
we see is you name there's a claim set out in the status certificate, but under the status certificate, you don't even have to give the amount of information you do in a PIC about the effect, the financial impact of that case.
Yeah.
So I get often, I'm sure you do, Patricia, the purchaser's lawyer says, hey, the manager told me to call the lawyer. So what's with this lawsuit? What risk is my client?
Yeah. And sometimes I'm not willing to assess the probability of success, but what I will say is, if you'd like a copy of the statement of claim and defenses, you're more than capable of ordering them as counsel, or, if the board is okay with it, we can send them to you, right? So that we're cooperative, but we're also not making guesses. Like, we will never say, oh yeah, absolutely, the corporation's going to win. It's a slam dunk. No lawyer worth their salt will ever say that.
Ever say that.
Ever.
Yeah.
The only things I have thrown out is things like, and it's usually in the certificate, Madam, Mr. Lawyer, note that this is an insurance claim and the insurer is defending it, or whatever the case. There could be that kind, but no assessment as to the value, chances of success or impact.
Right.
Okay. So the next question, when boards refuse to share details about major issues such as cooling towers not being in operation and requiring replacement, how much detail should we disclose? We sort of talked about this, about disclosure. Maybe I'll flip the question and say, what happens when a board of directors doesn't want you to disclose something? And usually that happens when they're about to sell their own homes.
Yes.
But what do you do in that scenario where a board of directors gets a certificate and says, no, I don't want this on here?
And I
I'm
think
making
we've
this
all
one up
had
as
that.
I go, but it's an interesting question.
I'll start, Patricia, then jump
Yeah.
in at any time.
hmm
I think for managers, you've got your professional duty to be giving proper advice to your board, which you do in a manager's report. And what this all boils down to is CYA. You've got to cover your posterior because that board member, if you agree with what the board says, do not put in something that should be in there and you've given advice, you've opened yourself up to a CMRAO complaint
Yep.
by a buyer or by the other owners. And of course, that board member will deny ever telling you to do that, and you're left hanging out there. So, number one, in writing, your recommendation. Remember, it has to be a good, proper recommendation, not, I think I've heard that there may be a problem in our building. Of course, you wouldn't do that. But if it's a thought out, proper one, in writing to your management, if the president or the board says don't put it in there, then I think you have a big problem. I think you should write back and say it has to be in, and therefore you sign this certificate. I don't think the manager can.
Yeah, I was going to say having the board in that case sign it. If they refuse to take your advice, have them sign it because it's not worth your license. And these things can be
Yeah.
nuanced, obviously. If it's, we've had
Correct.
40 leaks coming from the roof, but the engineers disagree on what the problem is. Okay, you still need to disclose that there's a problem and we don't know what it's going to cost. It could be substantial, but not including it, I think that's a great way to lose your license.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think you got to think about the scope of your obligations under the prescribed certificate to actually disclose information. Because I think Armand is right. When you have an issue like this, make sure that the minutes of the corporation in your discussions with the board are 100% clear on this failure. In the context of a status certificate, though, you really should provoke the question then and basically say to the board, would you like us to include this kind of information to the people in the status certificate? All right. Because then what you've done is you've actually brought the risk to your client, and your client under Section 37 better do the right thing. But what you've done is effectively then said, we have them acknowledge it is a problem and then go the distance and say, so why would we not include this so people know that this is coming? And then actually say, well, they can say, well, it's on the reserve fund study. It's actually going to be a project we do. Then note that duly for the minutes, right? So your minutes have to think through the full issue. And if you feel concerned, ask your board and say, board, take a position. Because for myself, if you brought that to me, I'd say put it on the status certificate. Let people know that this is coming. Because in essence, right, you may be able to say, we have a big expenditure coming. That's what this is. This question is very well worded because we just haven't gotten to the point of how we're paying for it. Is it a
Yeah.
special assessment? So Section 12 would be engaged if you had said, it's going to cost us $1 million. We would have just gone to Section 12. Here, you've hovered on the edge of it, but push it further with your board.
And I can tell you, Eric, I know we've had similar, all of us have had similar situations, but to Patricia's point, we had one case where the board, they didn't put in a special assessment that could happen or the amount, and then they turned on management and said, you should have put it in. And management could pull out an email and their management report that showed exactly what Patricia said, that they recommended that it be in the status certificate, and the board immediately backtracked and obviously didn't go after the manager, but they were trying to.
Mm-hmm.
And they will.
Yep.
When a lawsuit hits the fan, make sure you're protected. The next question has to do with rules. If a rule was sent out, but the 30 days have not passed, so it's not in effect yet, should it be included? And I'll add to this question and say it's a rule that would matter. Let's say it's a pet rule or a ban on smoking or something that could have a real impact if somebody moved in.
Yeah, I would put it in the package and just
Same with
say
us.
what the effective date is. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that over disclosure.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
goes to I agree with Patricia. You could say these are draft rules and there's still the 30-day period. You can still state all of that, but I agree with
Hmm.
Patricia. I mean, it
Yeah.
goes to the reverse of the, I think I may have mentioned at the webinar where in the status certificate, the manager put the wrong set of rules, not ones that were in the 30 days, and
Oh,
it had
yeah.
to deal with pets. And now the old rules had no restriction on pets whatsoever. You could be 100-pound dogs and 5 dogs. The new rules had one dog no more than 30 pounds. And of
Oh,
course, when this purchaser bought, they had two standard poodles, and the wrong set of rules were included in the status certificate.
Yeah,
It
that
got
causes so
resolved,
much
but
of a headache after the fact.
huge,
Um,
huge.
so include it, include the rule, and just make a note that it'll be passed as of
yeah.
September 5th.
Or you could say, it's still subject to the 30-day requisition period under section blank of the 58 of the Condo Act, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
will
Yep.
be a rule tomorrow. Okay.
Yep.
All right. The next one has to do with performance audits. So this is for new builds. So essentially, the question is asking if there's a number of items that need to be done as per the first and second year performance audit. Negotiations are in Terry on. The board doesn't know if they're going to have the developer do the work or go conciliation and take a settlement. What needs to be disclosed here?
Oh, I think just that they're in the Terry-on
That's
process.
all I would do.
It's a living, breathing kind of event. And
Yeah.
so, even your PATs change from month to month, week to week. So you don't even know what your strategic position is going to be. The developer comes in, fixes 100 out of 150 items, you take a check. But that's within the board's purview. I don't think it makes a difference in terms of the disclosure or managing the risk, just that we're in the Terry-on process.
Yes.
And
And
would
we
you
have
would you
lots of,
disclose how large of a claim we're looking at, or just we're in
Hmm.
the Terry-on process?
Oh, I would.
well, yeah, you would say you're in the Terry-on process and in accordance with the performance audit, whether you're first or second year, the amount of the claim is $800,000. You
Right.
could say that. Doesn't mean that's what you'll settle for. And we all know we have clients who settle with the developer under Terry-on. They get their money, but they don't do the repair because their engineers have said, yeah, that's a construction defect. It's a warrantable claim, but it's not critical. You could do it 10 years from now, but it is,
Yeah.
they got some money for it. Does that mean that money has to go for that? That's what you will be deciding, your board will decide at the time. So in other words, the disclosure is not always required on that.
Okay. Okay. So that's really it for the questions from the webinar, but I do want to talk about one other one that we touched on, and that was what happens during a handover from one management company to another. And just to explain the background here, say you're a management company, you're taking over a building. Now, in a perfect world, the building itself, the condominium has its own records, and you come on and you have all the records and all the old status certificates and the lawsuits and everything, and you can put together a status certificate based on that information on, between day 1 and 10. You've got your 10
Mhm.
days. In reality, that's not always how it works. In reality, the old management company tends to have a lot of the information. Sometimes they have email addresses that they use that are unique to them, and they'll delete that after they leave. Sometimes they hand over a certain number of documents and say that's it. And so you don't know that you haven't received something. You don't know what you don't know. Um, it's a bit of a tricky area because you only have 10 days. And in the webinar, we advised take the 10 days. If somebody has a rush order on day one of you starting in a building, tell them no, give me my $89 and I'll get it to you in 10 days. I'm sorry about your sale, and this being urgent, but too bad. But in those 10 days, you've got a lot to do now. You've got to, title search. You have to basically figure out what you don't know based on old status certificates or whatever else. Let's talk about that for a few minutes. I don't even know what the exact question is, but how would you deal with that? Where you're taking over a building, or a manager comes to you, they've taken over a building, and they just don't feel they've been given all the information. There's a lot of gaps there.
Mhm. Well, I think you can qualify your status certificate. And I think that's important. In the 1786 case that we talked about in the webinar, that was really one of the core issues there. And there was so much qualifying language. I think there were 18 major points that went on for 6 pages about inadequate or incomplete records that had been handed over to the new management company. And it was completely unfair for the new management company to take on that risk. So it was better to qualify the content. And I think so. I think that's the first thing is in the status certificate itself, qualify it and say, we do not have any more information at this time. Records are incomplete in their transition. Be straight out clear if you're concerned, because I've had clients where, or condos where they've done the transition and then the new manager says, we don't even have records. Like we have nothing. We've got nothing. That's important. And then I think as well on the management agreement side, when you're dealing with the boards, you have to take some proactive steps in the contractual relationship with the condo to say, when we come on as your agent, we are assuming that you are transferring to us a full set of records. To the extent that we are not going to be receiving a full set of records, and that's what this means, full set of records, you will be indemnifying us. So that indemnity provision, I think, has to be robust enough to capture this event. Because I think there can be a gap, but the question is whether the new manager should take the hit. I don't think they should, personally.
I agree with you. I mean, I had one situation, it was a while ago, where the outgoing management company did a data dump. And I think it was something like 75,000 documents. No organization. They said, here, we've turned over all the records.
Right.
And so what does the poor incoming manager do? Now, the one thing you do have, hopefully, one thread throughout all this is the board. The board, hopefully, is the same board that was there 2 years ago. Now, they don't know, of course, the details of every unit, but they certainly will know or should know of the bigger ticket items. Have we had a construction condition survey, a potential special assessment? We've got some major work that wasn't anticipated. Now, you may have a brand new board. Okay, that's another complication. But I would also go to the board. I like what Patricia said. You manage your risk, get to your board and say, to the extent of what records we have, we can do it, but we want that indemnity. But by the way, what else do you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I've had boards come back. I've got boards that have been there for 25 years, and they'll come back and they give a whole list of things that they know about. Boom, right to the manager, and then it can go in the status certificate.
And I think,
if you're lucky to have the continuity, and unfortunately, the worst handovers are the one where it's the board and management that are
everybody's
turned
new.
around.
Yeah,
and that's really where your risk is. I took over one, and it was from I won't name, but one of the large companies. And we said, well, where are all the boxes? Like they had that building for 30 plus years, really long time. They said, well, we keep the boxes at all of the buildings. The building said, no, the boxes are at head office. Well, there were no boxes. At the end of the day, someone must have shredded them at some point, but there were none. And that's the entire history was gone, including the email server that they used was their own email, not the condominium. So we came on, and two of, I think, the board members were the same, but what they knew was questionable. And we had the scenario where it wasn't right. It wasn't on day one, thankfully, but it was maybe 12 or 13 days in, and we're like, well, we know what we have here. We certainly don't know if there's anything else because we just don't have that information. And were we liable if there was a problem? I'm not sure. Maybe we were.
Well, and what are you measuring it against? You're measuring it against your deemed statements, right?
That's right.
So that's the other side of it. So that sets your benchmark of what could be our risk exposure. And then, when you're critically thinking through your reverse engineering sort of methodology. So let's say, okay, we're going to try and put stuff together. What is the risk exposure in getting that wrong? And, against the deeming statements, which is you're deemed to have said this, 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 well, you might be in the same position, right? It's whether there's value in qualifying anything. I think in Section 12 and, the Section 98 modifications, those kind of things, depending on the site, you can put some general qualifiers in there, at least to create some baselines to limit the risk if you just don't have the data.
And I think, sorry. Patricia.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Erica, in one of our meetings, I know you asked that question, should you not put in every paragraph of the status certificate, we don't know. Now, not in those exact words,
right?
But we don't have records, we don't know. And I think that has a risk to it, because at what point is that really a failure to disclose a material information and therefore the deeming provision? So I agree with Patricia, some general comment explaining the situation to the best of our knowledge, efforts have been made, etc. And then you go into the best you can in the rest of the certificate.
Right. Yeah, because if you
Yeah.
got a copy of the rules from the previous management from 1982 and nothing since then, yeah, maybe those are the most current rules. They might be, but
Hmm.
they may not be.
But
I
they
had
may
Yeah.
one
not.
recently. It wasn't a status certificate, but it was a handover, and I got in the declaration there was a list of everyone's parking spot, and in the previous status certificate there was lockers mentioned. And I went back to the management company I'm taking over from. I said, hey, I don't have any list of lockers, but I see that there is an exclusive use locker. So they sent me a list and it matched, not a single one matched with the declaration. And I said, well, what's going on? I've got a declaration with this list and I've got, your list, which is completely
Hmm.
different, which is correct. Well, the old one is old. I'm like, well, I don't think that's the explanation. Your declaration is what it is. So you've basically been violating the declaration, giving people spots that are not actually theirs. I need to know that if that's the case, because I have to figure out what I'm going to do about that.
That's right.
That in that case, I was lucky because I asked for a list and I got it, but I may give someone the wrong parking space if I go by what I'm given and what I'm giving isn't up to date. And there's a lot of it's a bit of a minefield there, right? Because you just don't know what you don't know. You have to ask a lot of questions, do a title search, get as much information as you can, because any one of those problems can bite you later on.
Very much
And I
so.
think part of your process, which is important, is making sure that you communicate with the management company that is handing over records as quickly as you can to
If they
to
communicate
put them
back.
on notice. Well, I would just put them on notice of all the deficiencies as well and say, these records are supposed to be turned over to us pursuant to the legislation. We have not received these, right? Because the quicker you do that analysis, from the time of the turnover, there's less likelihood that you got it wrong and that you lost anything,
Yeah.
right? Because the longer the gap, then everybody's going to say, well, we gave you that box. You
Yeah, of
must have
course.
lost it, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's also thinking about what you can do internally to maybe do your checks, your cross checks as quickly as possible and put the other company on notice. So, and then, you could also qualify it to the extent that the corporation is exposed to any losses that are caused by these omissions, we will be looking to you because that will, hopefully force a good response, which is, oh, I'm sorry, we forgot a box. Here you go.
Right. Yeah. Or here's a
Right?
file that, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's hard when they've got like 30 days to turn it over, and yet your status certificate is 10 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I said, sometimes you'll find that there's discrepancies between the percentages even. Like Schedule D is wrong in, one list versus another. The list that was the most recent mail merge for the budget shows these percentages and the declaration shows those percentages. And again, you've
Mm.
got 10 days if you don't bow to the pressure of the agent and do it right away, you've got 10 days to figure this out.
Which is
Sometimes
not
with a
much.
board that doesn't know, and sometimes with the management company that doesn't want to, that doesn't care anymore because they're gone. I think Patricia, good
Mm.
point. You're going to be put on notice if there's a problem and there's any lawsuits here.
Yeah, well, I think it has to be in your file too, because I think then they have a potential insurable loss coming their way. And, they may want to put their insurers on notice. This is another issue,
Yeah,
right? So because it becomes deeper and deeper depending on the omissions,
yeah.
that people need to sort of think backwards and cover themselves as quickly as possible so it's in the file. I think that's just key as a
And
protocol.
quickly as possible is, as Patricia said, is key because if we take ourselves outside the status certificate context,
Mm,
sometimes, and we've had issues where it takes months to get all of the reports. That doesn't help you, poor manager, when you got 10 days.
Yeah.
yeah,
So the
absolutely.
early you get word to them saying we're missing 14 boxes or where's the data on such and such, as soon as possible, get that to them.
Yeah.
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 And unfortunately, you may just not know until you start putting one together. If someone doesn't ask you until day 25 and you start looking, and again, there's a lot going on in the first month when you take over a building.
Right.
The status certificate is unfortunately one of the last things you think about unless someone orders it. You've got, you know, 15 dumpster fires to put out. You've got, there's a reason you're being called in to run a building. The last company uh, hadn't
Hmm.
been doing things the way the board liked. There's problems, so you're primarily there to fix those problems. Um, but again, it comes down to you don't know what you don't know, and sometimes you discover it a little bit after day one or day five, and either way, you've got to figure it out. Unfortunately, so it's a bit of a gap in this whole thing, I think. a
Can I
tough
ask
spot.
a procedural question,
Yeah.
Eric, from a management perspective? If you're taking over August 1st, and let's say there was a request for a status certificate 8 days before the end of the month, 8 days before the end of July, so it would trip into your new term. Do you push that back on the old management company or
Yeah, I
yeah?
wouldn't do that because essentially what you'd be doing is giving me 2 days
Right.
to deliver a status certificate
Mm-hmm.
at the price of the 10-day essentially, which is not like I wouldn't do that. The order would go to the previous management company. Um, if they're wise, they would do it. If they're really not, they would say, well, the new management's taking over, so it's not my problem. And then
Mm-hmm.
the people would email you before the beginning of your term, in which case you'd respond saying, I'm sorry, I haven't gotten all the information. I can't do this one for you. If you want to order it August 1st, I'm the right person to speak to. But if you need this urgently, you've got to go to your current company.
So, Armand, what would be a good way to manage the risk to the corporation? Because
Well,
this is between the two service providers. I understand Eric's position. It makes sense to me, but the corp is still out there, right?
Yeah.
yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come into play here. I see quite often, and hopefully in most cases, there's a transition period from the incoming to the outgoing management company, sometimes 2 and 3 weeks, sometimes a whole month. In a
Mm-hmm.
perfect world, you have that, and then you can start to see your records, what you've got, what you haven't got. That's the perfect world, and we know life isn't perfect. So what do you do when you get like Eric's scenario or Patricia's? Yeah, I think you've got to put them on notice. I think you got to look to the board. The board has to be brought in on the loop. They always have to be because you as a manager are speaking on behalf of your corporation. You're the incoming management company, and you do that certificate. You're binding the
Yeah.
corporation. So your board has to be part of that loop. Whether or not they respond is a different issue, but they have to be aware of the problem you're facing, which also could help you with the indemnity.
And keep in mind, I don't represent the corporation until August 1st. My contract doesn't start till that date. So no one has any
Right.
business coming to me and saying I want a status certificate if
Correct.
I'm not the
Fair.
management company.
Yep.
I have nothing to do with them except
And
that
you
I'm
don't have the
starting on August
records,
1st. And when I do
technically.
start August 1st, again, I have 10 days. I don't have it's not 2 days just because you asked the other company 8 days ago and they wouldn't do it. I still have my 10 days. And I'm sorry
Correct.
if that's hard for you in your sale, but ultimately that would be my position. And you're right that maybe there is a problem for the corporation in that sense,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the outgoing management company needs to do a faster certificate in that case.
And
Yeah.
they should. Yeah. And if they're organized and they're a good company, which many are, then I think they could do it or at least give you the information and say, we can't get it out by July 31st, but it's this, here's the file you can find in the computer, or here's the box,
Yeah.
here's the information. Now,
It,
are you going to do it after August 1st because they asked for it before? That's a different question, but at least you'll have the information.
it's interesting because it raises the point that if somebody requests one, let's say it's 2 days to month end, and
Mm-hmm.
they need it everyone needs it rush all the time, so forget that. But you've got the 10 days. So the outgoing company says, listen, it's Friday. Tomorrow's a weekend. I'm not doing it today. That's ridiculous. But the person requested it that day. Does the new management company still get 10 days? Because the law states, how does that work?
Technically not, right?
That's
That's
right.
my
Right.
point.
Because the
It's just still going to
corporation is
start
supposed to
running.
turn this over.
And the request comes through to the corporation and their
Right.
agent executes, right? And
Yep.
now we
Correct.
have a transition of agents, but the corporation is still the one on the hook. So what I was thinking is that maybe when a company is transitioning and you know that you are going to be taking over, it might be good protocol even just for the industry to say, we're coming on August 1st. We will not be managing any status certificates that have been requested prior to the commencement of our term. So accordingly, that falls in the bailiwick of the other property manager, and
Hmm.
they should just be advised of that. We expect a smooth transition, and we expect all status certificate requests to be completed by your corporation if you received it.
If you
Alternate,
received it before your termination date,
right,
that's
before
right.
your
Yeah.
termination, because the
Yeah.
10
Yeah.
days is still going to run. And
Yeah.
everybody
Right.
has a duty to
And
comply
what
with the
essentially that would
act.
do is if I'm the one coming on board, is that's forcing me to do a certificate under 10 days.
Yep.
Yeah,
Correct.
which
Whereas the other
again,
company
that's a big
could.
enough problem having the 10 days on a turnaround.
Yeah,
It is.
exactly. So I think it's something
That's
to
a bit of
think
an
through.
interesting thing that it
Logistics.
hasn't come up for us, but it could. And this is why we're doing a podcast on this because we couldn't get to all these details
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the webinar.
And you can get all kinds of things too, where you have a very angry outgoing management company or a very bad board, and they then say, well, Eric, here's your check to get off my property tomorrow. And meanwhile, they've already arranged for a new manager to come in. What do you do in that case? And then a status certificate request comes out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's rare that you're not rare. Hopefully it's not rare where you got that good month to do a nice smooth transition. And as we all say in the covering letters, we assume that you will act in accordance with your duties and act in a professional manner, blah, blah, blah. But there's reality.
Yeah,
We
but people
shouldn't
get
burn
mad.
bridges.
Yeah, but people get mad. It
Yeah.
They
happens.
do.
They do.
Not
It's
often. I would say not often. Most of the time, transitions are fine. Everyone understands that we take some, we lose some, but you just do get some. Usually, honestly, I'll put the blame on the board. Sometimes it's just a board that's, hasn't been fair to the management company, and the management company has a lot of grievances, and they don't want to put themselves out on the line anymore. So 2 days before month end, they get a status figure request. They say, no, I'm not. This is not my problem. I don't have the 10 days. I only have 2. So why should I have to do this?
Yeah.
So I get it from both sides. It makes sense, but it does leave a bit of a gap where the corporation, through their agents, has trouble delivering in 10 days.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely
Well,
tricky.
anything else you guys wanted to bring up on this? We're way over our usual 30 minutes, but that's fine. This is a special podcast.
All I would say to the managers, we're not trying to scare you. These things, a lot of times they are mind-numbingly boring because nothing's happening in your corporation. We're just trying to help for those tricky little questions, those times when you have such as a transition. But please don't take the podcast as getting everybody to quit the industry. It's not that bad out there.
No, and I think I mentioned it in the webinar. Like you said, 99 out of 100 of these things are fairly straightforward. You do your updates, and nothing is going to come of it. But when you make a mistake, it can be a big deal. That's just why we're doing this. We want to make sure that reduce that chance of making a mistake.
And I think it's important not to diminish the value of a status certificate. I think $100 does not reflect at all the level of risk associated with that document, with the content that is being permitted or presented and that is required to be disclosed. I think if you were going to price it, a real status certificate would probably cost at least $1,000 easily, even if it's templated, even if it's got some standard stuff, because you have to think about it. It's a living document. It's not something you do annually. You do it on the day that you're delivering it. So I think as well, the purpose of these webinars and sessions is to make us proactive, think ahead to what the risk is, and think, what kind of questions should we be asking ourselves? Do we have something on the horizon that's going to be a big capital asset project that was unexpected? And we know it's going to be huge. We just don't have a number. Then we should be talking about status certificate. Do we know that this is coming? And maybe we should just engage the lawyer right out of the gate, get the status certificate language done. Is it something we have to monitor? Because sometimes status certificates can change over 4 quarters, even 4 months. So I think it's more about thinking ahead and understanding that these documents are legally binding and they have an impact and a risk to be managed.
Absolutely.
I think the last point too, or for me, Eric, too, is for the manager, don't be hesitant to discuss them with your board. I know one of the questions was, should you give your all status certificates to your board? That may be overkill. But when we're getting into the meaty points that we're talking about, the special assessments, reserve funds adequately, et cetera, work with your board. You don't want to take the last status certificate. I mentioned in the webinar, that's what one time happened, and they used the wrong audited financial statements. They used the wrong year. That's a tiny point. But if you have something, don't be afraid once a year, twice a year to sit down with your board and say, okay, what have we got? What do we know is happening out there in our building, our community? By the way, our status certificates on these points say the following.
Absolutely. Like I said in the webinar, it's know your limits. When something is really tricky or complicated, go the extra mile and seek help if you need to. Go to your board, go to your lawyer. I'm going to cap it there because we're almost at an hour here.
Okay, we can keep going.
Huge thank you to Armand and Patricia on this one. Like I said, there's probably going to be a course coming out of this in 2026. One thing I will say, just on the topic of status certificates, we are campaigning to get the price raised through the government. There has been a petition circulated, so you'll see emails from ACMO probably coming out. We'll probably time it so that it comes out after the podcast. Please sign that petition because that will help. We're trying to gather support, put pressure on our elected officials and get this done. Because as I said, it is a bit disrespectful to the industry to have something that hasn't gone up in price since 1995 or whatever it was, where this much liability can come out of that. So once again, a big thank you to Patricia Elia, Armand Conant. Thank you guys very much, and stay tuned for quite a bit more on this topic.
Thanks very much, Eric. All the best to everybody.
Thanks very much. Take care.